Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Rookie Card Collector 123 video. In today's episode, we are going to look at one of the rarest baseball sets of the 19th century. And this set is actually not cards. I'll show you the front cover of the reference guide that I use for collecting these. These are New York Clipper, which was a newspaper that was put out from the mid 19th century all the way to 1900 or so. Covered mainly sports and theater, so basically different types of entertainment. One of the main areas of coverage for the New York Clipper was baseball. So once the baseball season started in April, they had various images of baseball fields, teams, and individual players that they produced over the years, beginning primarily during the mid-1870s and running mainly through the 1880s and 1890s. The images I'm going to show today are part of a set or a series. It began during the early baseball season of 1879, as you could see on the cover there. And these images ran through the early part of the baseball season in 1880. There's a total of 72 images that were produced as part of this set. So this predates the old Judge N172 baseball card series by about seven or 8 years. So this was actually the first significant baseball card issue ever produced. Again, not cards, but I'll show you what these are. So these New York Clipper baseball coverage newspapers not only provided write-ups and box scores from the games of the day, they also included what's called woodcuts. Woodcut is basically kind of the way it sounds. The newspaper would take a block of wood. They would use a photograph that was taken by a photographer, usually an albumin photo back in those days. They would develop the photo and then put the photo down on a table, take a block of wood, and basically carve into the wood the image of the player that appeared on the photo. So it was basically like a line drawing type of thing. It's not a real photograph. So the line drawing would then be filled, once it was carved out, would be filled with ink, usually black ink. And that would be then taken and basically stamped almost onto the newspaper where the write-up and the text and the other details from the New York Clipper appeared. So basically these woodcuts would appear on a sports page along with box scores and other write-ups from the baseball games from the season. Like I said, there was a total of 72 woodcuts made of individual players from this series, beginning in the early baseball season of 1879. I'm going to go over today 12 specific players. Almost all of them are in the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. Some of the earliest 19th century greats that were elected. There's a couple I'm going to cover that are not in the Hall of Fame, but as I talk about them, I will explain why I selected those in addition to the Hall of Famers. Many of these Hall of Famers, as well as the non-Hall of Famers, their appearance on these woodcuts in the New York Clipper would mark their earliest appearance on a cataloged baseball collectible, predating any cards that were ever issued, including many of them which appear in the Old Judge series. This reference book that I'm holding here was put out in 1984 by a gentleman named Lou Lipset. Lou Lipset, for the old long-time collectors, ran a website for probably 30 years or so. It was an auction site called oldjudge.com. It's basically an auction house where he did initially telephone auctions, Eventually, they moved to online when technology during the 2010 era progressed. They became online auctions, and he ran them as a one-man show. I believe his wife also helped out with some of the shipping and all, but for the most part, it was Lou running the auctions. And I mentioned him because one of his most prominent areas of expertise was these woodcuts, 19th century woodcuts, especially the New York Clipper ones. There were other newspapers from the 1900s, the 19th century that also had baseball woodcuts included in their sports pages. Harper's Weekly was probably the most abundant and most widely available. Most of those woodcuts tended to be full team images as opposed to individual players. Occasionally, they did also include individual, but mainly team. And also, there were some images of woodcuts made depicting scenes from actual baseball games going on. So it's going to have a baseball field with players and various other baseball info in the background. So I'm going to get started with the first player we're going to look at today. And I'll show you what the first woodcut looks like. They're all the same format. The first player we're going to look at is Roscoe Barnes, better known as Ross Barnes. And he was a second baseman during the 1870s, mainly the Boston Ball Club. At this point, this was the National Association prior to the National League being formed. The National Association started in 1871 and ran until 1875 before the National League was formed in 1876. So Barnes was an excellent hitter for the day, especially for a middle infielder. Terrific second baseman as well. And like I said, played during the 1870s, mainly for the Boston team. The Boston team was noteworthy because they also had manager Harry Wright, as well as shortstop George Wright. The two of them were brothers, both in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And they played on the original 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings team that appears on one of the first, or maybe the first, baseball card ever produced, with a Peck and Snyder advertising back. That one is in the format of a CDV, which is a team image. It includes George Wright, Harry Wright, and 8 or 9 other teammates on there from Cincinnati. So Ross Barnes is not in the Hall of Fame. If they ever get back to another 19th century election, there's a very good chance Barnes would be one of the top 5 or so candidates and stand a very good chance of getting into Cooperstown one day. Next up is going to be this is a Hall of Famer. This is James Deacon White. Deacon White was a catcher primarily, also played some first base and some outfield. He played primarily during the 1870s and 1880s, and he starred for the Boston team again, Cleveland, and Cincinnati. And I should have mentioned before when we looked at the Ross Barnes, the image on top is the woodcut, so it's the player image in a circular oval frame bordered by an ornate framing border. The player's name underneath, and then there's a pretty extensive biographical information that the newspaper did, basically summarizing the player's career up until that point. So again, these would have been put out, these are the early ones, so these would have been put out in 1879. So James Deacon White, National Baseball Hall of Famer. Okay, next up is another gentleman who's not in the Hall of Fame. Let's see. This is going to be Tim Murnane. Murnane played first base. He primarily during his playing days was with the 1870s Philadelphia team. Most famous for having Cap Anson on the club. He was the biggest star of the day. Murnane was sort of a journeyman player and wasn't a huge star. His main claim to fame would be after his playing days were over, he would go on to be one of the early baseball journalists and provide coverage in the baseball section of the newspapers and on the games, box scores, things like that. Murnane also appears on a T204 Ramley card in 1909. He had an executive position at that point. Here he is during his playing days, which again was 1870s Philadelphia and a short time with Boston as well. Murnane is not in the Hall of Fame as a player or in any other capacity. He is in a Hall of Fame wing for journalism, so he is recognized for that. And thus his couple of playing days cards that he does have, which are very rare, have more value than a typical journeyman player, as Murnane otherwise would have been looked at. Up next is going to be one of the great pitchers of the 19th century. Also played multiple other positions. John Montgomery Ward. John Monty Ward, I'm sorry. Ward was pitcher and infielder, primarily 1880s. And he played the first part of the decade with Providence, which is a powerhouse ball club with multiple Hall of Famers as well. And later in the decade, he moved on to the New York Giants, which would become the best team in baseball during the second half of the 1880s. One point they had 6 Hall of Famers on the roster at the same time. We're going to cover most of those today, or maybe even all of those today. So Ward, one of the leading pitchers, 300-game winner, and one of the early baseball stars. He is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And like I said, one of the great Giants from the powerhouse team from the late 1880s. Next player we're going to look at is, I mentioned before, the Wright brothers, George Wright and Harry Wright. So this is George Wright. George was a shortstop. He played on that famous 1869 Cincinnati club, which had the Peck and Snyder team CDV. CDV was, for those that are not familiar, CDV was an albumin photo, which was the way photographs were taken back in that day. They were mounted on a small, thinner piece of cardboard as compared to cabinet cards, which would come later on in the 19th century. Cabinet cards were larger and used a much thicker cardboard backing. The CDV was a thinner cardboard and much smaller, a little bigger than the size of a traditional baseball card would be today. So George Wright was one of the first, if not the first, superstar ball player in the U.S. Both him and his brother Harry came from England, where they were famous cricket players. They adapted to the American game of baseball. Wright played shortstop, was typically the best player on his team just about wherever he went. He played primarily in the 1870s, and that was with Boston and Providence. Again, 2 big powerhouse clubs from that era. George Wright is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Okay, next up we have Jim O'Rourke. Jim O'Rourke was a outfielder, first baseman. Played primarily for the again New York Giants, powerhouse ball club of the 1880s. One of the leading average and power hitters of the day. This is part of the dead ball era, so home runs were not really a big thing during the 19th century. A lot of guys actually would hit more triples than home runs. The league leaders oftentimes had more triples than homers during this stage. But O'Rourke was counted on to carry the offense in New York. Another National Baseball Hall of Famer, and a nice woodcut image there for Jim O'Rourke. Next up, we have an individual who has excelled in many facets of Major League Baseball. This is Albert Spalding, the same Albert Spalding that later on in life would own a sporting goods company, one of the two or three most prominent sporting goods and primarily baseball equipment sources in the world, or at least in the U.S. Spalding came up during the late 1860s, 1870s as a pitcher with Philadelphia again, the same Philadelphia club that had Cap Anson coming up in 1874. So Spalding pitched for them. Later on, after his playing days, he would move on to Chicago, where he was a manager. He was an executive. And then, like I said, eventually opened up, once his baseball major league career was over, he opened up a sporting goods company. He also had a lot of input in the Major League Baseball once his on-field days were over. He retained a lot of input on things like Hall of Fame selections and various other areas of professional baseball. Spalding, again, is a National Baseball Hall of Fame member and very important figure in baseball history. Okay. Next up, we have Tim Keefe. Tim Keefe was another 19th century star pitcher. Keefe played mainly during the 1880s. Began his career with Troy, which was in New York City. The Troy Ball Club, after the first 3 or 4 seasons, became the New York Giants, basically the same club. They just changed location and changed the name of the team. So Keefe was one of the original guys that came over from Troy, 300 game winner during the 19th century, and one of the great pitchers for the Giants. Him and another 300 game winner, Mickey Welch, would form the best 1-2 pitching tandem during the during the 19th century. And Keefe is also in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Nice woodcut image of Keefe here. Next player up that we're going to cover is one of the more famous, more popular 19th century ball players. This is going to be Mike, also known as King Kelly. Kelly played, again, primarily during the 1880s. He played mainly with Chicago for the first half of the decade, and then moved on to Boston. Famously was sold to the Boston team for $1 million. I'm sorry, $1,000. And Kelly would be primarily a catcher, also played outfield and some first base. Was an excellent hitter for the time, as well as a fantastic base runner and good defensive player. One of the early Baseball Hall of Fame elections. When the museum opened in 1936, Kelly would be selected a little while after that. Okay, next player we're going to look at here is Harry Stovey. Harry Stovey began his career in the 1880s with Philadelphia. That was his primary club. Stovey was known mainly for his first player really in professional baseball to have the what's now known as a power speed combination. You know, he was famous for stealing a lot of bases, as well as hitting the long ball. Again, back then, a lot of homers during the season might be 7 or 8 or 9, so it's all relative to being part of the dead ball era. But Stovey was the first power speed guy that today, the guys that fall in that category tend to be the 40-40 guys and 30-30 guys like that. He didn't have those kind of numbers, but for his era, he was the best. Okay. Next up, we have Dan Browders. Browders was one of the big home run hitters for the during the 19th century. Browders played first base. He played during the 1880s, and also his career also ran through almost the end of the 1890s. Began his career with Buffalo, and finished and played the majority of his days after that with Detroit. Browders played on a Detroit club with Sam Thompson and Ned Hanlon. They had 3 Hall of Famers that made up the nucleus of a mini dynasty that won championships in the 1886, 1887, 1888, in that range, and the National League at that time. Browders also is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and I believe is maybe around 19 or 20 all time in OPS, which is on base percentage plus slugging percentage. Once it's been adjusted for the era that the ball player played in. So Browders was a excellent player, excellent hitter, and a nice portrait of him. Next player up is going to be another big first baseman, another great hitter. Again, top home run hitter from the 19th century, Roger Connor. Connor played also like Browders. He played in 1880s through most of the 1890s. He's one of the guys like Tim Keefe that began his career with Troy, New York, in the 1880 time frame, and would stay with the ball club as they moved to become the New York Giants later on in the 1880s. And Connor was a significant home run threat, also top batting average guy, and part of the middle of the order and nucleus for those New York Giant teams that won multiple championships during the 1880s and early 1890s. Connor is also in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And the last player we're going to look at here for these New York Clipper woodcuts is going to be Mickey Welch. Mickey Welch was a pitcher for that same New York Giants ball club during the 1880s. Welch won 300 games. Also started his career at the same time as Keefe with the Troy ball club. Went on to become the New York Giants. Welch was the other half of the 1-2 pitching tandem along with Tim Keefe that allowed them to become a dynasty during the 1880s with New York. And Welch is also a National Baseball Hall of Famer. So that's going to wrap up today's episode on one of the rarest 19th century issues. Again, not cards, but yeah, these are called woodcuts. Hope you found some good information. Maybe learned about some new ball players that you were not familiar with before. Um, there hasn't been a lot of content put out there, I don't think, for 19th century baseball, either players or cards. Not nearly as much as the turn of the century stuff. So I thought it would be a good idea to get this out there. You know, this reference book that Lou Lipset put together 30, 40 years ago now. It was a huge help. I used to collect and had many of these woodcuts myself at one time. When I was collecting them, I was able to get Beckett to encapsulate and grade them as authentic only. I don't think PSA or SGC, they would not do it back then, and I don't think they would do it today. Beckett, I'm not sure if they still would encapsulate these or not. But they're authentic, very rare. I would venture to guess the ones I had encapsulated might still today be one of ones. But there are other newspapers out there. Some of them may still be intact with the woodcuts still part of the newspaper pages. But if you wanted to, you can cut them out, and I used to put them in top loaders. Eventually, I got them graded by Beckett, and I had just about all the Hall of Famers. So it's an interesting endeavor, and another alternative. These at the time I was collecting, these were not very expensive at all. They tended to be a couple of $100 each or so for 19th century cards, like Old Judge and stuff. You can't get anything of a Hall of Famer for anywhere near that kind of price. So if you're on a budget, it's a way to try to get some of the 19th century players. Not going to be easy to find, but keep an eye out in auctions, and hopefully you come across it at some point. So I hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.